She had been working at the little cafe on Main Street for almost 5 years. Every morning, she arrived before the sun, wiped the tables clean, and made sure every cup and plate was spotless before the first customer came in. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it was honest work, and she liked helping people in her small way. She remembered the faces of her regular customers, remembered how they liked their coffee, and she always tried to make someone's day a little better, even if it was just with a kind smile or a friendly word. That morning felt no different from any other. The sun peeked through the thin curtains, casting a soft glow across the wooden tables. The cafe smelled of freshly baked bread and strong coffee. She hummed quietly as she arranged the pastries in the display case. Most of the early customers were regulars: an elderly man who liked black tea, a young mother with her small daughter who always pointed at the chocolate muffins, and a group of office workers who came in every day at exactly 9 o'clock. Life moved slowly and comfortably here, in a rhythm that was predictable and safe. But that morning something unusual happened. A man walked into the cafe, and immediately, she noticed that he didn't belong here. His clothes were expensive, though slightly wrinkled, like he had been traveling all night or had been caught in some kind of trouble. His shoes were polished, his watch glimmered under the light, and yet there was a look of worry etched across his face. He kept glancing around nervously, as if he expected someone to follow him. He didn't sit at the tables. He just stood near the counter, eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. She approached him with a warm smile. "Good morning. Can I get you something to drink?" she asked. Her voice was calm, friendly, and unassuming, the kind that made people relax without realizing it. He jumped slightly, then looked at her with tired eyes. Just coffee. Black, please," he said, his voice low and hurried. She nodded and started making his coffee, noticing the way his hands shook slightly as he held his wallet. There was something in his eyes, a mix of fear, exhaustion, and desperation, that made her pause for a moment. She had learned over the years to read people, to sense when someone was carrying more than just a heavy bag or a hard day. And this man, she could feel that he was carrying the weight of the world. As she poured the coffee, she glanced at the small TV mounted on the wall. It was turned to the news channel, and the ticker at the bottom caught her attention. She read the words slowly, almost in disbelief. Billionaire businessman faces major fraud allegations. Court case begins today. Her eyes widened. The man at the counter looked exactly like the man on the screen. She felt her stomach tighten. He was famous, one of the richest men in the country, and here he was standing in her little cafe, looking lost and vulnerable. She handed him the coffee. "Here you go. Take your time," she said gently. He nodded, mumbling a quiet thank you, and took a slow sip. The tremor in his hands didn't stop, but at least he seemed to calm slightly. A few minutes later, the door swung open again, and a journalist rushed in, camera in hand, looking for a story. "Sir, can we get a comment?" he called out loudly, pointing at the man at the counter. The man flinched. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly unsure what to say. The journalist stepped closer, ignoring the other customers, shoving the camera into his face. Without thinking twice, she stepped in front of the man. "Excuse me," she said firmly, her voice steady. "You're not going to get anything here. Please leave." The journalist looked at her as if she had grown horns. "And who are you?" he demanded. "I'm the person who runs this cafe," she replied calmly. "And I won't let you harass anyone here, no matter who they are." The man behind her looked shocked. His eyes were wide, and he opened his mouth as if to speak, but she shook her head gently, signaling him to stay quiet. The journalist, frustrated and muttering under his breath, finally turned and left. The man behind her let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you," he said quietly. His voice was tired, but there was a hint of relief now. "It's okay," she said, smiling softly. "You can stay here. No one will bother you." He looked around the cafe, at the small wooden tables, the simple chairs, the smell of bread and coffee. He looked like a man who had been chased by the world for weeks and found a tiny island of peace. Over the next few days, he returned to the cafe several times. Sometimes, he just sat quietly, sipping his coffee, watching the small world move around him. Other times, he spoke to her in low, hurried tones about what had happened, about the accusations, the court case, and the lawyer who had been supposed to defend him but had suddenly abandoned him. She listened without judgment. She didn't offer advice she couldn't give, and she didn't try to impress him with her own knowledge. She just listened, and somehow that was enough. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, he felt like he could breathe. One afternoon, she noticed how tired he looked. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes shadowed, and he barely touched his food. "You need to eat something," she said, placing a plate of soup in front of him. He shook his head. "I can't," he said softly. "Too much stress. I don't know what to do." She sat down across from him for a moment. "I can't solve your problems," she said gently, "but I can be here for you. That counts for something, doesn't it?" He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. It wasn't pity or curiosity in his eyes. It was trust. A fragile, cautious trust, but trust nonetheless. Word of his presence in the cafe began to spread quietly. Some regulars whispered, trying not to stare too much. The news cameras even appeared once, but she always made sure he could avoid them, slipping him out the back door if necessary. And then the day of the first court hearing arrived. He looked worse than ever, exhausted, worried, unsure if he could even face the day. She watched him leave the cafe that morning, feeling a strange pull in her chest. Something told her that he needed more than just coffee and quiet support. He needed someone to believe in him when the world had already turned its back. She didn't know what she could do. She was just a waitress. But she had learned something in her life. When someone is alone, sometimes all they need is a small act of courage from another person. She resolved silently that she wouldn't let him face that courtroom alone if she could help it. As the day passed, she went about her work, but her mind kept returning to him. The news channels reported the court case, showing footage of a man who looked so similar to the man she had helped. They called him a billionaire, a suspect, a man at the center of a scandal that shook the business world. But to her, he was just a man in need, a man who had been abandoned by those he trusted, standing on the edge of despair, and somehow managing to hold on. And she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. It was the kind of story that nobody would believe if they heard it later. A simple waitress noticing a man in trouble, stepping in quietly to offer kindness and protection, and slowly becoming someone who mattered in his life in ways she couldn't imagine. But life had a strange way of turning the smallest acts into something enormous, and she had a feeling that her little act of courage was about to change both of their lives forever. The sun set behind the cafe that evening, casting a warm orange glow across the street. She closed the doors, wiped the counters, and paused for a moment, thinking of the man who had come into her life so unexpectedly. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she felt ready. If the world was going to challenge him, she would be there in her own quiet way. She would be there, and she would do whatever she could to protect him. And somewhere deep inside, she knew that this was only the beginning of a story far bigger than either of them could imagine. The next morning, she arrived at the cafe early, as usual, preparing for another long day. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the warm light of the rising sun made the room feel cozy. She arranged the pastries, checked the orders, and hummed softly while sweeping the floor. It had been a quiet start to the day until the door opened, and he walked in. He looked worse than the day before. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his hair messy, and there were deep lines of stress on his face. But there was something different too. A flicker of relief in his eyes as he saw her behind the counter. She smiled gently at him and nodded, silently telling him that everything would be okay, at least for now. "Coffee, please," he said softly, his voice still tired, almost hollow. She prepared it and placed it in front of him without a word. She could see that he wasn't ready to talk yet. He sipped slowly, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for trouble. After a few minutes, he finally spoke, in a low voice that barely rose above a whisper. "I don't know how I ended up here. Everything is falling apart. My lawyer, he just left me. Just like that. Abandoned me in the middle of everything. She nodded quietly, letting him speak. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice yet. She had learned that sometimes the most important thing was just to listen. People carried so much inside them, and a kind ear could be more powerful than any solution. I trusted him, he continued, his hands shaking slightly as he held the coffee cup. He was supposed to protect me, to guide me through this, and then he just left. And now the press is all over me. People in my company don't know who to believe, and I feel completely alone. She leaned slightly forward, her voice gentle but firm. You're not alone, she said. Not here. Not while I'm around. Sometimes the world turns its back, but that doesn't mean you have to face it by yourself. He looked at her, his eyes filled with disbelief and a little hope. You don't even know me. You don't have to care. She shook her head. I don't need to know everything to care. Sometimes it's enough to see someone struggling and just be there for them. That counts for something. He stayed silent for a while, sipping the coffee, looking down at the table. She could see the tension slowly leave his shoulders, just a little. It wasn't much, but it was something. Days passed and he continued to come to the cafe. She began to notice patterns in his behavior. He would arrive early, order the same black coffee, and sit in the corner where the sunlight hit just right. Sometimes he stared at the window, lost in thought. Sometimes he scribbled notes on scraps of paper he pulled from his briefcase. He rarely spoke to anyone else, and when he did, it was quick and clipped. She watched him carefully, not in a nosy way, but in a way that allowed her to understand what he needed. He needed someone who would notice the small things, who would understand without judgment, and who could offer a little bit of stability in a life that was spinning out of control. One afternoon, while she was wiping the counters, he spoke suddenly, his voice low but urgent. I think someone is trying to ruin me from the inside. My business partner, he's not who I thought he was. There are things happening in my company that don't make sense. Documents disappearing, funds being moved, and now my lawyer is gone. I feel trapped. She nodded slowly, taking it in. It sounds like you're under a lot of pressure. I can't imagine what it feels like to be in your position, but you don't have to face it alone. Sometimes, seeing things from someone else's eyes can help, even if it's just a little. He looked up at her, studying her face as if weighing whether to trust her with more. Finally, he nodded. Maybe you can help me in your own way. I don't have anyone else. Everyone else. They've either turned away or are trying to take advantage. She felt a mixture of fear and determination. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't have connections in the world of billionaires and corporate power. But she had something just as important: observation, honesty, and courage. And she realized that maybe courage was exactly what he needed right now. Over the next week, she began to help him quietly. She listened to the details he shared about his company, his business partner, and the strange events that had been happening. She took notes, carefully recording dates, times, and small details he might have overlooked in his stress. She didn't pretend to have all the answers, but she offered clarity where she could. Sometimes just asking the right questions made him see things he hadn't noticed before. One evening, as the cafe was closing, he lingered longer than usual. He looked tired, but there was a spark in his eyes, a sense that maybe he wasn't completely lost. You've been more helpful than you realize, he said quietly. Just by listening and noticing things, you've given me something I haven't had in weeks: hope. She smiled softly. Hope is powerful, she said. It can be the first step toward finding a solution. And sometimes, just knowing someone believes in you, it's enough to keep going. The day of the court hearing approached quickly. He came in that morning looking pale and nervous, carrying his briefcase but leaving it closed. She noticed how tightly he gripped it, and her heart went out to him. He had no lawyer, no ally, and the world was watching. The thought of him standing alone in the courtroom made her uneasy. I don't know if I can do this, he admitted quietly, more to himself than to her. Without my lawyer, it feels impossible. Everyone is against me. The press, the people in my company, even my friends. They're all turning away. She placed a hand gently on his arm. "You're stronger than you think," she said. "And you're not as alone as you feel. I'll be there. Not in court as your lawyer, but I'll be there for you. Sometimes, support is enough to make a difference." He looked at her, searching her face. There was no pretense, no judgment, only sincerity. "Thank you," he whispered. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she replied. "Just trust that someone is on your side." The morning of the hearing arrived, and she found herself outside the courthouse, nervously adjusting her coat. She wasn't sure why she felt so responsible for him. She wasn't a legal expert, she wasn't wealthy or powerful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he needed her. She watched as he entered the building, shoulders hunched, carrying the weight of the world. All day, she waited, pacing outside the courthouse, listening to snippets of news updates on her phone. Reporters were camped outside, cameras ready, rumors flying faster than the truth. She clenched her fists, wishing she could do more, wishing there was a way to shield him from all of it. Finally, as the sun began to set, she saw him exit the courthouse. He looked exhausted, drained, but there was a small flicker of something in his eyes. Relief, perhaps, or just gratitude. He didn't speak much, just nodded at her as he passed, and she nodded back, silently promising that she would continue to stand by him. That evening, back at the cafe, she sat quietly, reflecting on everything that had happened. A man who had been abandoned by those he trusted, standing on the edge of despair, had somehow come to rely on her small acts of kindness and observation. She wasn't sure how the story would continue, or if she could really help him in the ways he needed, but she knew one thing: she couldn't turn away. And somewhere deep inside, she realized that life had a way of bringing people together in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes, a simple act of noticing, a gentle word, a cup of coffee, could change someone's life forever. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to be a part of his story, to stand with him when the world seemed determined to pull him down. Little did she know, the days ahead would challenge both of them in ways they could never imagine. And yet, she was determined. She would be there. She would help him. And no matter what happened, she would do everything she could to protect him, even if it meant stepping into a world that was completely unfamiliar and dangerous. That night, as she closed the cafe and turned off the lights, she whispered quietly to herself, almost like a promise. "I won't let him face this alone. I will protect him." The morning of the hearing arrived faster than she had expected. She woke up before dawn, her mind racing with thoughts of him. She dressed quickly, keeping her movements calm and deliberate, though her heart beat faster than usual. Today would not be just another day at the cafe. Today, she had promised herself, she would be there in some way, standing by him, even if it was just as a quiet presence. Outside, the city was already awake, the streets full of people hurrying to work, buses and cars honking in the usual chaotic rhythm. She stepped out and walked toward the courthouse, her mind focused, yet filled with a quiet worry. She didn't know what she would do if things went badly. She didn't have legal experience, and she certainly didn't have the influence or wealth to make things easier. All she had was her courage and the determination to be there for him. That had to be enough. When she arrived, the courthouse was buzzing with activity. Reporters were setting up cameras, microphones, and tripods, hoping to catch the first glimpse of the billionaire, who had suddenly become the center of attention. Lawyers in sharp suits were rushing past, carrying briefcases and arguing on their phones. Security guards kept a careful watch, and a line of curious onlookers had already gathered outside the entrance. She spotted him as he entered, flanked by a few assistants who looked tense and worried. But something was immediately clear: his lawyer was not with him. The absence hit her like a sudden, cold wave. She had heard the rumors, yes, but seeing him walk alone in that environment, vulnerable and exposed, made her stomach tighten. His shoulders were hunched, and he kept glancing around nervously, as if expecting some invisible danger to appear at any moment. She took a deep breath and followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention to herself. Inside the courtroom, he was led to the front, where the judge would hear the case. She slipped into a seat at the back, keeping her presence quiet but intentional. From this vantage point, she could see everything. The judge, the prosecutors, the courtroom staff, and most importantly, him. He looked small in that large room, surrounded by people who held authority over his fate, and she felt a pang of concern. The session began, and immediately the pressure of the courtroom environment became clear. The prosecutors spoke with confidence, presenting documents and evidence in a way that made the situation seem even graver than it was. The judge listened carefully, occasionally asking pointed questions, and it was evident that without a competent lawyer, he was at a disadvantage. She watched him struggle to keep his composure. His voice wavered slightly as he tried to respond to questions, and she could see the frustration building inside him. It was as though every word, every movement was being scrutinized, and he had no support. The assistants beside him whispered here and there, but they were no substitute for someone who knew the legal system and could defend him properly. Suddenly, a murmur ran through the courtroom. Whispers spread like wildfire. His lawyer had officially withdrawn from the case, leaving him entirely alone. The judge paused, looking at the empty seat where the lawyer should have been, and then back at him. "Do you have anyone to represent you at this time?" the judge asked, his voice formal but tinged with concern. A hush fell over the room. He looked around, panicked, searching for some sign of help. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second, wide with disbelief and fear. She could feel his desperation, and it made her heart ache. He had faced challenges in business, in life, in wealth, but nothing had prepared him for this moment of utter vulnerability. She didn't hesitate. Something inside her stirred. A mix of courage, loyalty, and the deep sense that someone needed to stand for him when everyone else had turned away. Rising from her seat, she walked toward the front of the courtroom, her footsteps steady despite the nervous pounding of her heart. All eyes turned toward her as she reached the center. "I will protect him," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. The words seemed to echo through the courtroom. For a moment, the room froze. Reporters gasped. The judge blinked in surprise, and the billionaire looked at her, utterly stunned. You cannot," whispered one of the assistants, but she ignored them. She was not here to follow rules she didn't agree with. She was here to act in the face of injustice. "I will protect him," she repeated, louder this time, making sure everyone could hear. "He does not have to face this alone." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "And who are you, young lady?" he asked. She took a deep breath. "I am someone who has seen him struggle. I may not be a lawyer, but I have observed the events, the inconsistencies, and the unfair treatment he has faced. I will do what I can to help ensure that justice is served." Murmurs spread through the room. Some people scoffed, others whispered in curiosity, but the sincerity in her voice was undeniable. She was calm, clear, and fearless in a way that drew attention. The billionaire's eyes never left her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she saw hope flicker across his face. "You have observed what?" the judge asked, leaning forward slightly. She explained briefly, carefully, that she had been keeping notes of irregularities and odd occurrences, times, dates, and behaviors that might not make sense on their own but formed a pattern when pieced together. She had no formal legal training, but she had clarity, and sometimes clarity could be more powerful than fancy words or expensive lawyers. The judge nodded slowly, clearly weighing the situation. "Very well," he said at last. "We will allow a review of the materials you have presented and consider whether it may assist in ensuring a fair process." The prosecutors looked taken aback. They had not anticipated this interruption. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and she could see the doubt in their eyes. The billionaire exhaled slowly, relief washing over his face in a way that made her heart ache with empathy. As the session continued, she remained close, quietly taking in every word, every document, every moment. She knew she could not provide legal advice, but she could support him in other ways, by noticing the unfairness, pointing out discrepancies, and giving him the courage to stay upright when the world was pushing him down. During a break in the proceedings, He turned to her quietly. I don't know what to say, he whispered. I've never had anyone do this for me before. Not like this. You don't need to say anything, she replied softly. Just focus on getting through this. I'll be here. He nodded, taking a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he had someone in his corner. Someone who genuinely cared, someone who was willing to stand up when others had abandoned him. The courtroom sessions stretched into hours, the tension almost unbearable. The prosecutors pushed hard, trying to intimidate him, using every tool they had to make him falter. She watched, silent but alert, ready to intervene in whatever way she could, even if it was just offering moral support with a quiet glance or a reassuring nod. Finally, as the day drew to a close, the judge called for a recess, allowing everyone to step out. He was visibly exhausted, but the spark of hope in his eyes had not disappeared. He turned to her, gratitude shining in his tired face. Thank you, he said quietly. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up. She shook her head gently. This isn't about me. It's about fairness. You deserve a chance to be heard. Don't give up now. He managed a small smile, one that felt genuine, and something shifted between them. She realized that the connection they had formed went beyond the usual boundaries of social status or roles. He was no longer just a famous businessman facing a scandal. He was a man in need of courage, and she was someone who could offer it. That evening, as she walked back to the cafe, she reflected on the day. Every step felt heavy with thought, but also lighter with purpose. She had done what she could to protect him, and that had made a difference. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments of fear, more tests of courage, but she also knew that today had proven something important. Standing up for someone, even when it seems impossible, can change everything. The sun had set, painting the streets in shades of orange and pink. She unlocked the cafe, cleaned the counters, and arranged the chairs, her mind still on him. He had faced humiliation, fear, and abandonment, and yet he had survived the day because of a small act of bravery. From her, someone ordinary, unnoticed by the world until now. And deep inside, she felt ready for what was coming next. She had promised herself she would protect him, and she would not break that promise. No matter how difficult, no matter how dangerous, she would remain by his side in her own quiet, determined way. The story of the billionaire who had been abandoned by his lawyer was far from over. But one thing was certain, he was no longer alone. The next morning arrived with a quiet tension that seemed to hang over the city. She woke before sunrise, her mind restless, replaying the events of the last hearing over and over. The thought of him standing alone in the courtroom still made her stomach tighten. She had spent hours preparing herself mentally for today, knowing that this could be the day everything changed. As she walked toward the courthouse, the streets were busier than usual. Reporters jostled for position outside, cameras and microphones ready to capture the first moment he arrived. Security guards moved with sharp precision, directing the crowd and ensuring no one got too close. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of expectation, fear, and excitement. She felt the weight of her own nervousness but pushed it down, focusing on what she had promised herself. To be there for him, no matter what. Inside the courthouse, the air was heavy with anticipation. Lawyers, clerks, and the judge all took their places, and the room was filled with the quiet hum of whispered conversations. She slipped into the back of the courtroom, scanning the room until she saw him. He looked tired, worn, and anxious, but there was a determination in his eyes, a will to survive this ordeal. Her presence seemed to give him a small comfort, though he didn't know how to express it. He had never imagined that a simple waitress, someone from an ordinary cafe, could stand up for him in a way no lawyer had. And yet here she was, quietly confident, ready to face the challenge with him, even if it was in an unfamiliar and intimidating environment. The session began. The prosecutors wasted no time, presenting their evidence in sharp, confident tones. Documents were waived, allegations repeated, and the judge listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions. He tried to respond, but without a lawyer, every answer felt risky. Every word he spoke was measured, cautious, and filled with hesitation. Then it happened, the moment everyone had been waiting for, though no one wanted it to come. The judge asked, "Do you have anyone to represent you at this time?" His voice echoed in the room, formal and heavy. The empty seat where his lawyer should have been stood out painfully. A cold silence filled the courtroom. All eyes were on him, and he looked around desperately, hope fading from his face. She couldn't wait any longer. Rising from her seat at the back, she walked toward the front of the courtroom. Her footsteps were steady, but her heart pounded fiercely in her chest. Every eye turned toward her as she approached. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I will protect him," she said, her voice strong, clear, and unwavering. The words hung in the air, shocking the room into silence. Reporters froze with their cameras. The judge blinked in surprise, and the billionaire looked at her as if he had seen a ghost. His eyes were wide, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else, hope. You cannot," whispered one of his assistants, a hint of panic in their voice. But she ignored them. This was not a time to be timid. This was a time to act. "I will protect him," she repeated louder this time. "He does not have to face this alone. I have observed the events, the inconsistencies, and the unfair treatment he has faced. I may not be a lawyer, but I will do what I can to make sure he has a fair chance." The judge leaned back slightly, studying her carefully. "And who are you, young lady?" he asked. She took a deep breath. "I am someone who has seen him struggle," she said. "I have watched the unfair treatment, the false accusations, and the way people have abandoned him. I cannot provide legal representation in the traditional sense, but I can offer observations, evidence, and support to ensure that justice is served." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Some people were skeptical, some curious, but there was a seriousness in her tone that could not be ignored. She met his eyes, and for a brief moment, the fear in him softened. He realized that she meant every word, and that this ordinary woman had just become the most extraordinary ally he had ever had. The judge nodded slowly, intrigued by her confidence. "Very well," he said. "We will allow a review of the materials you have prepared and consider whether they may assist in ensuring a fair process." The prosecutors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had not expected this interruption. They had assumed that without his lawyer, he would be defenseless. Now, someone completely unexpected had changed the balance. She stepped forward, placing a folder on the table. Inside were her notes, observations, and timelines of the strange occurrences he had shared with her. Each page carefully documented the inconsistencies, the unusual behavior of his business partner, and the suspicious events that had led to his legal troubles. She didn't speak with arrogance or pretension. She simply presented the facts as clearly as she could, letting them speak for themselves. The billionaire watched her quietly, almost in awe. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Someone who had no obligation, no reason, had stepped into his life and taken a stand for him. The hopelessness he had felt just hours ago began to fade, replaced by a fragile, but real, sense of hope. Throughout the hearing, she remained attentive. Whenever he looked unsure or faltering, she offered a subtle nod or a small smile, silently telling him to stay strong. She couldn't argue legally on his behalf, but she could provide him with reassurance, the confidence to stand tall even when the world seemed determined to tear him down. The prosecutors tried to challenge her, questioning the validity of her observations and the credibility of her notes. But she remained calm, composed, and honest. She did not exaggerate, she did not speculate. She simply presented what she had seen, what he had told her, and the patterns she had noticed. And in doing so, she gave the judge something he could not ignore: clarity, simplicity, and the courage to act fairly. Hours passed, and the tension in the room grew almost unbearable. The billionaire's face was pale, his hands clenched tightly together, but he no longer looked completely defeated. He looked at her now, drawing strength from her presence. He realized that he was not alone. that he had someone willing to fight for him in ways he hadn't imagined. During a break in the proceedings, he approached her quietly. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. "I've faced so many people who abandoned me, who only wanted to see me fail. But you've done something I never expected." She shook her head. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "I am here because it's the right thing to do. No one deserves to be left alone in a moment like this." He looked at her, gratitude and relief mingling with the exhaustion in his eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, he believed that he might survive this ordeal. He might not have all the answers, he might not know the outcome, but he knew that someone in this world cared enough to stand with him. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere was tense but focused. The judge reviewed her notes carefully, asking questions that highlighted the inconsistencies she had observed. The prosecutors struggled to counter her points, their confidence shaken by the clarity and honesty of her presentation. Slowly, the balance began to shift. What had seemed impossible, finding a voice of reason in a courtroom stacked against him, was now happening before everyone's eyes. By the end of the day, the judge announced that the case would be temporarily paused to allow for further investigation. It was not a victory, not yet, but it was a lifeline, a chance for the truth to be examined and for the billionaire to defend himself properly. Relief flooded his face. He looked at her, eyes shining with gratitude and disbelief. I don't know what to say," he whispered again. "You don't have to say anything," she replied. "Just keep believing in yourself. That's all that matters right now." As the courtroom emptied, she walked beside him briefly, making sure he felt supported. Outside, reporters crowded the steps, trying to get a comment, but she guided him past them, shielding him with calm authority. He had faced the world alone for so long, and now he realized that even in the chaos, someone ordinary could make an extraordinary difference. That evening, back at the cafe, she reflected on the day. Every detail, every tense moment, every look exchanged in the courtroom replayed in her mind. She realized that courage wasn't about wealth, status, or power. It was about standing up when it mattered most, even when the odds seemed impossible. And she knew one thing for certain. This story was far from over. The challenges ahead would be greater, the stakes higher, and the tests of courage more demanding. But today had proven something essential, that even in the darkest moments, one person's bravery could ignite hope and change the course of someone's life forever. She closed the cafe that night, her hands trembling slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. She whispered to herself, almost like a promise, "I will protect him. No matter what comes next, I will not let him face this alone." And somewhere deep inside, she knew that the next days would push them both to their limits. But she was ready. She had chosen to stand, to fight in her own way, and to be the unexpected shield for a man who had lost almost everything. For the first time, she realized that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they acted with courage, honesty, and heart. The days after the courtroom confrontation were tense and uncertain. He returned to the cafe quietly, avoiding the press and the eyes of the public, but each visit carried a weight he could hardly shake. She noticed how tired he looked, how the stress lines on his face had deepened, and how he still flinched at the slightest noise outside the cafe. The world outside hadn't stopped spinning, and neither had the challenges he faced. But there was a subtle change in him, a quiet confidence that had begun to grow since she had spoken up for him in court. "I don't know how to fix everything," he admitted one afternoon as he sipped his coffee, his fingers nervously tapping the table. "The lawyers, the investigations, the accusations. It's all so overwhelming. I feel like I'm drowning." She reached across the table, gently resting her hand on his. "You're not drowning," she said softly. "You've survived worse than most people could imagine. And you're not alone. You have people who care and who are willing to help you navigate this. That matters more than you think." He looked at her, a faint smile breaking through the exhaustion. "You've done so much already," he said quietly. I don't even know how to repay you." "You don't have to repay me," she said, shaking her head. "Just focus on getting through this. That's enough." Despite her words, she couldn't ignore the fact that the challenges were far from over. The next hearing was scheduled in a few days, and the evidence she had provided would be scrutinized closely. He still didn't have a proper lawyer, and the pressure from his business partner and the media was relentless. Every day brought a new challenge, a new article, a new threat. But she remained by his side, quietly observing, taking notes, and offering support wherever she could. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city streets were bathed in a warm orange glow, he sat across from her in the quiet cafe. "I've realized something," he said, his voice low. "I've realized that most people around me care more about my wealth than who I really am. But you see me. You see me as a person, not a billionaire. And that's something I can't forget." She smiled softly. "That's all anyone needs sometimes, to be seen, truly seen." The next court date arrived, and this time he had contacted a lawyer she recommended, a careful, ethical professional who had agreed to take the case seriously. The lawyer reviewed her notes and observations, amazed at the detail and clarity she had provided. These small but significant pieces of evidence began to form a bigger picture, one that could challenge the accusations against him. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense but different this time. He stood taller, more composed, his eyes meeting hers across the room. She gave him a subtle nod, a silent message to stay strong, to trust that he was not alone. As the hearing began, the lawyer presented a strong case, using her observations as crucial evidence. The prosecutors tried to challenge it, but the clarity and simplicity of her notes made it difficult to dismiss. The judge listened carefully, asking questions and reviewing the timelines she had documented. Slowly, the tide began to turn. What had seemed impossible just days ago, a man abandoned by his lawyer and left to face overwhelming odds, was now shifting toward fairness and justice. During a short recess, he approached her quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he whispered. "You've changed everything. You've given me hope when I had none. And I can't thank you enough." "You don't need to thank me," she replied, smiling softly. "I just did what I could. That's all anyone can do." The remainder of the hearing continued with a newfound energy. His lawyer skillfully presented the case, and every point she had documented helped strengthen his defense. The inconsistencies in the accusations, the suspicious behavior of his business partner, and the evidence of the lawyer who abandoned him were all laid out clearly. For the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. Finally, after hours of tense discussion, the judge made a decision. The charges against him were reviewed thoroughly, and the case was delayed to allow a proper investigation of the evidence she had helped gather. It was not an immediate victory, but it was a lifeline, a chance for the truth to be uncovered. Relief washed over him, and he turned to her, eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just from the court, but from despair. I don't know how to ever repay you." "You don't have to," she said gently. "Seeing the truth come out, seeing you have a fair chance, that's enough." Over the following weeks, the investigation proceeded carefully. The lawyer used her notes and observations to uncover the corruption within his company, revealing that his business partner had orchestrated the entire situation to take advantage of him. Documents were examined, witnesses were questioned, and slowly the truth emerged. The press began to report more fairly, acknowledging the irregularities and the evidence of wrongdoing on the part of his partner. He returned to the cafe often, sometimes just to sit quietly and breathe, sometimes to discuss the developments. Each visit showed subtle changes in him. He was calmer, more confident, and slowly regaining the energy and focus that had been drained from him by weeks of stress and fear. One afternoon, he sat across from her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," he said softly, "most people wouldn't believe this story if they heard it later. A billionaire abandoned, a waitress standing up in court. It sounds impossible, but it's real. And it's because of you." She shook her head gently. "You survived because you never gave up, even when it felt like everyone was against you. I just helped you see that you weren't alone." As the months went by, the truth became undeniable. His business partner was exposed for fraud and manipulation, and the lawyer who had abandoned him was held accountable for unethical behavior. The accusations against him were dropped entirely, and his reputation slowly began to recover. Instead of returning to the life he had before, he made a decision that surprised many. He invited her to join his company, not as a secretary or assistant, but as an ethics advisor, someone who could help him ensure that fairness and honesty guided every decision. She had never imagined this, yet she accepted, knowing that her role would be to continue supporting him in a meaningful way. The first day in her new role, she walked into his office, feeling a mixture of nervousness and determination. He greeted her warmly, a genuine smile on his face. "Welcome," he said. "I don't know how I got so lucky to have you in my life, but I'm grateful every day." She smiled, feeling a sense of purpose and accomplishment. "Thank you for trusting me," she said. "That means more than anything." Over time, their bond strengthened, built on trust, respect, and the shared experience of surviving a storm together. She helped him navigate complex business decisions with integrity, always reminding him of the lessons learned during the court battle. Honesty, observation, and courage could overcome even the greatest challenges. People often whispered about their unusual partnership. Some doubted her abilities, others mocked the billionaire for trusting a former waitress. But within weeks, she proved her worth. She identified two corrupt executives attempting to manipulate the company, exposing them before any damage could occur. Her insights saved the company millions and strengthened his trust in her judgment. One evening, as they walked out of the office together, he paused and looked at her. "You saved my freedom, my career, and in a way my life," he said sincerely. "The least I can do is trust you with my future." She smiled quietly, realizing that this journey had changed them both. She had stepped into a world she never expected, faced challenges she never imagined, and yet had made a difference. Not through wealth or power, but through courage, honesty, and the decision to stand up when it mattered most. The story of the billionaire and the waitress became more than just a tale of courtroom drama. It became a story of human courage, of standing up for what is right, and of the extraordinary impact one person can have on another. Their lives were forever intertwined, not by wealth or status, but by the quiet determination to protect, to believe, and to fight for fairness when the world seemed determined to abandon them. And as she looked at him, seeing the man who had been abandoned and now was rebuilding his life with honesty and integrity, she knew that her promise had been kept. She had protected him not just in court, but in the moments that truly mattered. And together, they would face whatever came next, stronger for everything they had endured. In the end, it was not the wealth, the power, or the fame that defined their story. It was courage. It was trust. It was the decision to stand up when everyone else had walked away. And that, she realized, was the kind of story that would never be forgotten.